Get started. So first off, I want to apologize on behalf of my co-presenter. He's not going to be able to make it. He had a slight family emergency. His wife broke her arm and had to have surgery to get it set. So they're taking care of that in Little Rock today. So I apologize on behalf of that. But Wes wanted to let me know that if you have any specific questions about, what he's doing with his production systems as far as cover crops and rice, feel free to reach out to him. I believe his contact information is in the programs. So I would encourage you to do that. What I have done is a lot of the research that I've been doing with cover crops and rice rotations has been in projects where Wes has been associated. So I've tried to pull in some of the data from those specific projects that we've had on his farm. So there will be some of that included in this today. The title of my talk is going to be Managing Rice with Cover Crops, and I'm just going to kind of go through and give a synopsis of a lot of the different things we've encountered. As far as the topical outline, talk about cover crop adoption, kind of what the limitations are, what the potential benefits would be. Some of the reasons why I think we need to start really looking at cover crops and rice production systems, what types of factors currently limit cover crop adoption, and then potential benefits from cover crops into rice rotations. I always like to throw this up just to kind of remind people, cover crop adoption across the United States, it varies greatly depending on what region of the country you're in. If you look, major incorporators, southeast, eastern seaboard, a little bit out on the west coast, but as far as Arkansas goes, the majority of the locations that we have information on, we have less than definitely less than 5% cover crop adoption in the majority of the state. This was from 2012 Census of Agriculture, so it's just a little bit dated, but if you look at some of the surveys we've taken more recently, just on local county level scales, what you get into is you have several producers that have 100% adoption, and then you have other producers that have 0%. And so when you consider that, that's kind of where we're ending up with this low percentage of total acres into cover crop adoption. We're hoping to kind of change that for several reasons. The one thing that I've always said is if we can get cover crops to work in rice production systems, we can get them to work anywhere just because of the way that rice is managed, the things that we have to do, the high biomass production, all those different types of things. This is just some information that I took from a survey from CTIC Conservation Center, and it was responses from producers as to why they were interested in cover crops or the potential benefits of cover crops as they saw it. And the top one up there is improved soil health. And so that was kind of the overwhelming, we want to plant cover crops because our primary benefit is going to be an improvement in soil health. The second one there, erosion control, I thought this was very interesting that many producers actually linked cover crop usage with reduced erosion. And this is probably one of the biggest ones that I think is going to be impactful for Arkansas, specifically, is erosion control. And the reason I bring that up is if you look at Arkansas freshwater systems, what are the two primary impairments of freshwater systems in Arkansas? What's that? Sediment. So a lot of times people just assume nutrients are the problem. But if you actually look in Arkansas, the majority of the freshwater systems are actually impacted by what we call sedimentation and turbidity. And those are two direct results of erosional soil loss. So when we think about sedimentation, that's the heavy soil particles that get washed out of fields and clog up ditches and drainage ways and those types of things. Turbidity you also see a lot of times, but that is the soil particles that stay suspended in the water column, and they actually lead to the murky or kind of cloudy factors that you see in the surface water. And so this is just clay particles and suspended sediments that aren't really heavy enough to settle out a solution. But those are our two primary freshwater impairments, and it's directly related to erosion loss. One of the big things that I've found as I've talked to producers is this idea of what is erosion? And when people think of erosion, this is usually the first image that kind of pops into your head. You know, a big gully, something you can't drive a tractor across. You know, we have these images of what we think erosion looks like. And so when I talk to rice producers, a lot of times they have precision leveled fields or even zero grade fields. Their immediate response is, I don't have an erosion problem because my ground is flat. Right? So there's this misconception that if you have flat ground, you're not having erosional soil losses. But I always like to ask people, like I actually had a producer tell me, I don't have an erosion problem. At the same time, his hired hand was digging out the drainage ditch adjacent to his rice field. So I asked him, I said, well, if you don't have an erosion problem, why are you digging out your ditch every 2 or 3 years? Oh, well, because it gets clogged up with soil. Well, where does the soil come from? Well, he started thinking about it for a minute. He said, well, I guess it comes off all these fields that drain into this ditch. And so, like, you know, even though we don't see these drastic representations of erosion in our fields, we are getting significant amounts of erosion. And, you know, when we think about rice production, it's a lot of times, tillage intensive. You know, we think that we've got to disc it and harrow it and float it and do all these things to plant rice and get it to grow effectively. And I think that's a mindset that we've kind of got to get away from as we move into the future. And I think the combination of cover crops and no-till can help solve a lot of our problems. Another big benefit that I think people are overlooking as far as cover crops is potential nitrogen credits. If you choose your cover crops correctly, there's potential that you can get a significant amount of nitrogen credits from those cover crops, which can ultimately reduce your nitrogen fertilizer inputs. So this is just an example of a nitrogen rate study where we were following winter fallow with the blue bars or Austrian winter pea with the orange bars. And if you look at where we applied 0 pounds of N per acre, this difference in yield between the fallow and the Austrian winter pea, that's basically the nitrogen credits that were gained from that Austrian winter pea cover crop. So essentially you're going from somewhere around 60 to a little over 100 bushels. And with that, you know, essentially what we're saying is the Austrian winter pea cover crop is giving you about 40 bushels worth of nitrogen in this 0 N rate. When you look at nitrogen response trials, eventually you should be able to add enough with that particular cover crop. If we look at the range of nitrogen credits that we've seen in our research, we get anywhere from 45 to 212 pounds of nitrogen from an Austrian winter pea cover crop. And that's entirely related to how long you let it grow in the spring before you terminate it. So the longer you let that Austrian winter pea cover crop grow, the more nitrogen credits or potential nitrogen that you're going to get out of it. If we look at an April 1st termination or burn down date, we get roughly 108 pounds of nitrogen per acre from that Austrian winter pea cover crop. If you let it go all the way to what we would call first bloom, that's where you're going to see the highest amount of nitrogen credits, and that's when you're going to hit this 212 kind of pound cap of nitrogen potential. But an April 1st termination date in our studies leads to about 108 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If you look at current urea costs, you would have to save about 125 pounds of N per acre to cover this Austrian winter pea cover crop cost. So that's kind of what you're looking at from that standpoint. But if you go a few years back, when urea prices were much higher, then we only need 55 pounds of nitrogen credit from that Austrian winter pea cover crop to cover its cost of establishment and termination. So that just kind of gives you an idea of just looking at one aspect of a cover crop, nitrogen credits, how much it can potentially be worth.
What was the seeding rate on your winter peas on this?
So 45 pounds is kind of what we shoot for. And the reason we go with 45 pounds is to try to get ample ground cover through the winter. So you can plant them at a much lower seeding rate and still get those nitrogen credits. It's just if you plant it at 25 or 30 pounds, you know, you've got to plant every foot or so, and you're not getting the erosion control in the winter that you might, you know, as another potential benefit.
Are you doing just strictly winter peas with no other crops in the mix?
So this particular example is just winter pea.
Okay.
And like the graph I showed a minute ago was just a straight winter pea without anything blended in. What I'll talk about in a minute is some of the things that we've mixed with Austrian winter pea to kind of help with some of those other issues. So I also wanted to look at this idea of what limits cover crop implementation across the country. And so this is another survey from 2010 from a cover crops council in the Midwest, but we've actually seen much similar data here in the Mid-South from some of our surveys that haven't been formally finished yet. But the biggest overwhelming response is this idea that there's not enough time to establish cover crops in the fall. And we wanted to take a closer look at that. And if you look at mid-September in Arkansas, we typically have about 60% of our rice remaining in the field. If you go to mid-October, we're typically going to have about 40% of our soybeans still remaining in the field. So if you look at kind of that optimum planting window for cover crops, which is between mid-September and mid-October, we've still got a very significant amount of our acreage that hasn't been harvested yet. And so I think that's where this timing issue kind of comes into play is, you know, we're still trying to harvest a lot of our summer cash crops when we need to be planting and establishing those winter cover crops. The other thing that people don't give enough credit to is the better your cover crop performs, the more benefits you're going to get out of it. And so you can't treat cover crops as like a stepchild or just, you know, some kind of trivial thing. You're going to throw some seed out there and you're going to get all these benefits out of it. You know, the more time and investment that you put into that cover crop and the more growth and the better the cover crop performs, the more benefits you're going to get out of it for your following cash crop. So you really have to take that into consideration. And the earlier we plant, the better off or the better those cover crops are going to perform. So one thing that we've actually taken a look at is overseeding. So can we potentially overseed winter cover crops into soybean effectively to give us kind of this head start and eliminate this problem with late planting or late harvested soybean? So one of the studies that we looked at was overseeding different species of cover crops into soybean anywhere from the R6 growth stage until maturity. And we compared that to drilling the cover crops immediately after harvest. So this is just an example of the setup we used. We just used a Gandy fertilizer box to overseed. And this isn't anything new. I mean, you know, people have been planting wheat overseeded into soybean in Arkansas for a long time. We're just trying to see how cover crops can do with that overseeding and kind of get, you know, seeding rates and timings as appropriate as we can. So this is an example of tillage radish that we overseeded into soybean at about the R6.5, R7 growth stage. And our best results for overseeding was right before what we would call the major leaf drop. So when you start to get that senescence and it's turning yellow, if you can get that seed out just before you get that primary leaf drop, that's going to be the best time to overseed your cover crops. So you can see this is just an example. We overseeded. This is the tillage radish coming up. And you can see the soybeans here that have not been harvested yet. This is an example of the same experiment, but this would be cereal rye that was overseeded. And then this is an example of that same study, which is a picture the following February. And so you can see here on the left, this is the cover crop that was overseeded into the standing soybean. And on the right, this is the cover crop that was drilled after we harvested the soybean. So you can see there's a pretty significant difference in the growth and the performance of those two cover crops. And this is actually the same seeding rate. So we overseeded at the same seeding rate as we drilled. But, I mean, what's the major difference leading to the performance? So what's the factor that led to such a drastic difference in those two situations?
Growing days.
growing days. So if you look, there's roughly a month difference in the establishment of those two cover crops, because we were able to overseed the cover crop into the soybean roughly a month earlier than we were able to plant it post-harvest.
But if it's for erosion control, the erosion control on the right side is just as good as the erosion control on the left side, because the residue, the stubble's still there.
True, yeah, if you're going no-till and you keep the soybean residue, but, one thing that you have to kind of consider going down the road is, if you had a bad winter like we had this year, and you get...
They're all bad.
Well, they're not all bad. This one I consider much worse than others. We've got results from this year where we're getting stand loss because of the cold temperatures. And so if you have this and you're getting stand loss, then you're losing those benefits going down, further down the road. But in a high residue system, yes, you're going to have that erosion control, but you're not always going to have that residue to help with the erosion control.
What was the date on the overseeded side? The date it was overseeded?
So this overseeding would have been like the end of September. I don't remember the exact date, but the last week of September is when we hit that kind of like our 6.5 growth stage. This is an example of the tillage radish, and so you see the growth being very drastic on this particular cover crop species, and it just has to do with the fact that tillage radish is more sensitive to those growing degree days. It does the majority of its growth in the fall, and so the earlier you can get it planted and established, the better off you're going to be. The one thing that is probably most often missed with something like tillage radish is that once you break dormancy in the spring, the only biomass that you put on is the bolting when it flowers. So all this biomass is mainly derived in the fall, and it just has to do with the way that particular crop species grows. So if you don't get the biomass in the fall, it's not going to be there the next spring. Whereas when you look at cereal crops, they put on the majority of their biomass in the spring after they break dormancy. So you really need to take that into consideration when you're looking at species selection as well as timing. So I would say one of the biggest issues we have in a lot of our major rice production areas is goose pressure. So we've got a lot of producers down in Stuttgart, Lodge's Corner area that, they go plant a cover crop and they spend that $25, $30 an acre, and the geese come in and their cover crop is gone. And a lot of these cover crops, especially like Austrian winter pea, the geese love Austrian winter pea better than anything else because I guess it tastes better, it's high nitrogen content, and they'll go through and literally just pick a field of Austrian winter pea clean. So one of the biggest issues that we've had in a lot of our rice production specific scenarios is getting cover crops that the geese don't come in and just wipe out. So initially we started with black oats. So if you've ever noticed geese, we noticed, I guess, in the variety trials where we had wheat and oats and different winter cereals planted, a lot of times the geese would mow off the wheat and they'd skip over the oats and then eat the wheat again. And there's some pubescence and some different things on oats that I think kind of deter the geese. And so we planted a blend of black oats and Austrian winter peas. And if you have this many geese land on your field, they're going to eat the black oats, they're going to eat henbit, they're going to eat everything. And so, one of the major issues that we've encountered is you've got producers who are spending money on cover crops that they never get the realization or the benefit out of because the geese graze them all off. And so actually one thing that we've found that the geese will not eat is blue lupin. So how many people have ever heard of blue lupin? You want to tell us anything about blue lupin? So until this year, I'd never heard of blue lupin. If I'm trying to think, has anybody ever seen like a Texas bluebonnet? So that's like the same family as blue lupin. And what it is it's actually a legume that is a winter legume. It's a little bit of a different, we'll say, classification as like what we would think of as soybeans and those types of legumes. but it does fix nitrogen, and I don't know how to describe it other than it has a really weird odor. And so if you take the stalks, which this is an example of the blue lupin here, and you break them open, it's just a really, really odd smell. And apparently that's a deterrent for the geese. So geese will not eat blue lupin. So this is the first year that we've actually kind of dealt with this specifically for rice production. So we don't have any data on the amount of nitrogen credits that it can fix. But if you look at some of the data out of Texas and other areas in the southeast that have worked with this particular cover crop species, they actually say you can get more nitrogen credits than Austrian winter pea. And so they've got data showing as much as 350 to 400 pounds of nitrogen credits. I think one of the issues that we'll encounter with blue lupin is the pictures that I've seen at maturity. It's got a pretty big stalk on it if you let it grow, almost like a sunflower type of stalk. And so I think that's going to be a major concern for us as far as termination timing, is getting it killed before it gets, too big to cause problems with planters and those types of equipment. The other thing I'll say about this is, as far as I know, there's no U.S. seed production. So everything that's brought in actually comes from like New Zealand. So they grow it there during our summer and then they ship it up here. So seed production and availability is a little bit limited, but I think if we're able to show it is a beneficial cover crop for Arkansas, we'll be able to get some increased options for this type of winter legume. The other big issue with rice production is residue. So a lot of times after we finish harvest, we've got a lot of residue remaining in fields that we've got to deal with. And producers, when you see something like this, the last thing you can imagine is probably trying to go in and plant a cover crop into this type of residue level. And we've actually been very successful with this with pretty limited and almost no modifications to equipment. And we have a CIG grant, which is a demonstration project with several different producers across the state, where we're actually implementing no-till practices and cover crops simultaneously. And so when we think about this residue management, I think it's kind of a mindset issue that we have to get over. So even though there's all that residue out there, you can effectively establish cover crops into it as long as you take the time to kind of do your research and do it effectively. Another issue that we kind of have to think about is, residue burning. And so this past year, there's been a lot of issues that have come up concerning residue burning. And I think this is probably something that we're going to have to get away from. And actually, cover crops can be very beneficial to help you break that rice residue down. And so what we've found is where we plant the winter cover crops versus where we don't, we actually have less rice residue remaining the following year for when we go back into plant rice. And it has specifically to do with the nitrogen that your winter legumes will add back to that soil system. They help break down that rice residue. So when you come back into plant the following year, you actually have less residue than where you did not have the winter cover crops. This is an example of some of the cover crops that we've planted into rice stubble. The best method that we've found is following harvest, whether you use a stripper header or a draper, is to simply roll the residue. So we don't actually incorporate the residue. We're just rolling it flat. And then we came in, this is just, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it was like a 1590 John Deere box drill, nothing special, just a double disc opener. And as long as your residue is fairly dry, you can cut through it and plant pretty effectively. This is an example of an Austrian winter pea and black oat cover crop mixture that we put together. Part of the reason we're promoting this for rice production is the black oat kind of serves as what we would call like a nurse crop for the winter peas. So it's going to grow and give you that biomass for your erosion control and those types of things. And then your winter pea just kind of sits there through the winter. And when it breaks dormancy in the spring, it's when it's going to put on the majority of its biomass. This is just another example of that same blend that we planted. Actually, Lance, you've seen this field. So this was in Walnut Ridge with Fred Schmidt was one of the producers. And this was actually a strip trial that we looked at where we had a winter fallow compared to the black oats and the Austrian winter peas mixed together. This is a close-up of that same picture, just to give you an idea of kind of how that looks. So this was taken in early December before it really got cold. So this would have been the fall growth in that particular production system. So just to give you an idea of what we're seeing with some of these field scale strip trials, we've been doing this for several years with a couple of different producers. So we're trying to capture not only the immediate short-term benefits, but kind of the long-term benefits of using cover crops with continuous rice over time. So just as an example, this field that we're talking about here up near Walnut Ridge, it would be classified as a jackport silt loam. We're going to roll the rice stubble following harvest. We do a blend of Austrian winter pea and black oats. The total seeding rate for this, we usually shoot for about 45 to 50 pounds. And it's usually a split of about 75% Austrian winter pea and 25% black oat as that particular blend. We burn down the cover crop. And for this specific one, a lot of times we can get by with gramoxone and some type of photosystem 2 inhibitor. And what that does is it helps capture all the cereals as well as the broadleafs in there. He planted taggart in this particular field. The nitrogen rate to achieve maximal yield was 90 pounds per acre single pre-flood, and his final yield for that field was about 185 bushels per acre. Wes's field, this would be just right around Sherrill in Jefferson County. So it's a very heavy perry clay right near the Arkansas River. He uses a Kelly diamond harrow to knock down his stubble following rice harvest. He's not really incorporating it. It's more of just kind of rolling it down flat to make it easier to plant the cover crop into. He did the same blend of the Austrian pea and black oats. Burned down, the variety that he selected was actually CL153, and the nitrogen rate to maximize yield in this field was 130 pounds of N per acre, and his yield was 198 bushels per acre. So for this particular field, we actually had a nitrogen response trial across the turn row in a field that did not have cover crops, and the yield maximizing N rate for that field was about 210 units of N per acre. So I know they're different fields, but we always tend to think that clay soils, we're going to need 150, 180 plus units of nitrogen to maximize yield. And so we think there's a significant amount of nitrogen credit coming from that Austrian winter pea cover crop that we can capture in this. I think one of the biggest things that the producers enjoyed about this was, for Wes in particular, he didn't see any yield drags. So one thing that he found when he started doing cover crops with soybean was a lot of times he would have yield drags for the first couple of years. And with his rice, he hasn't seen any type of yield drag from the implementation of cover crops. You talk to Fred, I think in a lot of cases he feels like his rice was better following the winter cover crops than where he was traditionally just doing zero grade conventional tillage rice production. So I think in the end, one of the biggest issues that we kind of have to think about and focus on is this idea of time versus management or time versus money. And in order to make cover crops work in any system, and especially in rice production systems, is how much time are you willing to implement into the management of that cover crop? Because the more time you invest in it, the more you're going to get out of it. And ultimately, the way that I look at it is it's your time versus your money. I think Robbie, a lot of the talks that he gives, I think that's the message that I get, is the more time he implements with his cover crops, the more money he can save. And I think that's the way that you've got to look at it. It's definitely something that you have to be committed to. It's not a trivial process that you can just go out and plant it and forget it and come back the next spring and expect, all these types of benefits. The last thing that I'll just close with is kind of this idea of what will drive cover crop adoption in the South. For me, being a soil scientist, I think erosional soil loss is a big issue that we need to start paying more attention to. You get a lot of producers being frustrated with the current system. One issue in specific parts of the state is herbicide-resistant weeds. I think this is a tool that can potentially be used to help combat some of those weed issues. And I think coming down the road in the future, irrigation water use and availability is also going to kind of drive cover crop adoption. When you look at kind of what I would consider a highly sustainable, efficient production system, if you could bed your ground and plant soybean, or if you could bed your ground in the fall and plant a cover crop, and then no-till soybean into the cover crop, and then plant cover crop following soybean harvest, keep your beds, you're not doing any tillage, terminate the cover crop, and plant rice and grow furrow irrigated rice, I think you could find that would be a very sustainable system that you could save a lot of input costs on.
So are you looking at doing research on different cover crop mixes in row rice production? Because, you're really gonna be looking at a lot more for weed suppression in the row rice than you would in a flooded rice condition.
And the water infiltration.
And the water, so
Yep.
So we need to look at whether, cereal rye has any allelopathic effects on the rice, but that's the one that you need more for the weed suppression, for a row rice system. So that's what we need to be looking at.
Yeah, so we've actually done quite a bit of that research. So we've got rice following cereal rye, black oats, barley, winter wheat, and then we have a whole suite of like legumes that we planted it behind. So when you go into row rice, I think the biggest thing that you change is the blend ratio. So when you go into row rice, you're going to want more cereal for that weed suppression versus the legume for the nitrogen credits. So that's the trade-off that I think you make in a row rice system, whereas in a conventional, direct seeded delayed flood system, I would push more legume for the nitrogen credits because you're not necessarily going to need that biomass for the weed suppression. But to me, that's the difference, is the ratio of the winter cereal to the winter legume in the cover crop mix.
Well, I'm a consultant, and I've done several thousand acres of row rice, and I've done some of this in the cover crop stuff. I spent about a month out there on my hands and knees trying to figure out what I had. And some of that ryegrass and stuff. It worked in the long run, but I'm serious. I'm on my hands and knees out there calling and trying to figure out what you got. It's not, and I don't mean that to sound really ridiculous, but you've got to figure out whether you've got a crop or whether you don't. That was one of my main problems with it, is trying to figure out whether I had a stand or didn't have a stand, or.
You're talking about your rice stand.
It's any crop.
Yeah.
I did it with my soybean this year. 'Cause I let it get really, really rain. And, what my saying when you go into a soil health system is you've got to spend more time on your feet and less time in the seed. Because in a conventional system, you can do a 55-mile-an-hour drive and tell whether you got a stand or not. And know from the seed. You cannot do that in this system.
Well,
And you hope when you go check the whole field, if you check 10 spots, you hope the other million spots you didn't check were the same.
Well, yeah, that's true. It's not, you don't know if this side of the field's the same as that side of the field,
Yeah.
but really, we had enough time, and we made a crop. We'd had some skippy spots in it, but it wasn't that bad. We made a real decent crop in the long run. But I was about to pull my hair out trying to figure out, okay, I need to tell this guy to replant, and we need to do something different. What? So we go a couple of weeks there. I don't know whether I should already replant it or not. And maybe that's just as simple as, like you said, the mix you plant, or how big you let it get, or all that kind of stuff.
Well, like in our experience, the bigger you let the winter cereals get, so the taller you let them get, the easier they are to plant into, and the better the rice stand that you will get. So we've looked at termination timing, where we basically terminated when the winter cereal broke dormancy all the way to when it headed. And the best rice stands that we got were any time when you had basically joint movement in the cereal. Because if you get that joint movement in the cereal, it's easier to cut through. It tends to stay standing and not really mat down, and that's where we got our best rice stands.
Our chemical side of it turned out to not be, probably a little less because of all that cover on the ground.
When you're drilling the cover crop into the rice straw in the fall, you are rolling it down, you are. They were, in the last talk, they were drilling into it standing up. What's your opinion on it? In my mind, if you leave it, if you roll it down, it's just gonna be a mat of keeping moisture in there for the spring when I'm trying to get in there and plant. But what do y'all feel on that?
So I think it's preference, and you got to figure out what works for your system. So on the lighter textured soils, it's like sandier soils, I think you can roll it without any problems, but you start getting on your heavy clays and stuff, I think anything you can do to keep it standing, the better off you're going to be. The reason that we rolled it is the producer didn't feel comfortable planting his cover crop into 2-foot tall rice stubble. So that's why that particular producer chose to roll it.
Have you tried any overseeding in the rice?
Not into rice, but that's something we definitely want to look at for like a continuous rice production system, is to try to overseed. In soybeans, I think it's really easy. In rice, I think it's going to be a little bit more of a struggle. Just off the top of my head, I think you would almost want to actually overseed before you harvested.
I was saying, what about like right at draining or right behind draining?
Yeah.
Good moisture.
Just because I'm afraid if you wait till after harvest, you're going to get no soil contact, and you're just not going to get very good establishment of your cover crop. But that's actually kind of the next step in our process, is to do the same overseeding study into rice at different timings. The reason we did this particular way was, the majority of people are soybean going into rice, so that's what we started with.
Do you have some narrow wheels on the tractor or something when you did the overseeding? Like if you were going to overseed in rice, you wouldn't use a full-size tractor wheel.
You'd fly.
Yeah, you'd use an airplane.
I saw a tractor running in some.
Well, for our small plot stuff, yeah, we use a tractor. So the plot width is only 6 foot, and so we're overseeding that 6-foot plot.
You're using an airplane to overseed.
Yeah, in a production situation, you would use an airplane to overseed the cover crop. I mean, there's a lot of people that have looked at. We had a guy in Jefferson County that overseeded with like one of those narrow tired highboy fertilizer spreaders, and he had pretty good success.
Jen, is there any scenario where we can plant a cover crop, not run on rice straw, still flood for waterfowl in late December?
No, that's
Not enough time.
yeah.
It would be actual dollars. You could find, there's some seeds that grow fast, that would be the opposite. You would drain it, and as soon as you got a warm enough temperature, you'd plant in the spring.
Yeah. So
And that would actually work out a lot better going out of rice into a soybean situation, because you could put your soybean planting out, just, instead of, say, the 1st of May, you may push it to the 15th of May, or the middle of April to the middle of May. Because you still got some time to get some growth in the spring.
But anything you're doing with winter flood it's going to cause more challenges. But I think, like Robbie said, you don't want to plant it in the fall. You want to do your winter flood, and then when you drop the flood, you can get some cover crops that you could establish in February, March, and you could get a month or two of growth before.
Rice that ratoons and then gets flooded, whatever falls down, it's a lot of times it's gone by the next spring just because the water and you've wasted. I think you've wasted your money because it's not going to be there.
Yeah,
Just noticed in platoon crops that the rice straw seemed to just disappear by the time we cut the second crop. And just having something out there growing seems to decompose the previous crop faster.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the cover crops, anytime you can put a legume in there, it's gonna help with that residue breakdown. But if you're doing winter flood, you're kind of taking winter cover crops out of the mix, or it's not an option really. Well, if there's no other questions, the CEU sign-in sheet is on the back table if you need those, and